Wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining the Hidden Costs of Data Centers. My name is Kelly Hammond. I'm with your Citizens Action Coalition, and we are so grateful to all of you for joining us tonight. We are, of course, recording this webinar, and we'll make both a recording of the webinar and the slides that you'll see through the presentations tonight available on our website, specifically our data center webpage, which we'll be sure to include a link to that before this call wraps up. Um, as you can see, we have quite a bit of ground to cover this evening, so I just wanted to quickly flag that after the presentations wrap up, we will conclude the webinar with a question and answer session. So as questions come to you tonight as you're listening to the presentations, please use the Q&A function to type in your questions. But do be patient with us because we will wait to respond to all the questions until the end of the call. And if we do not get a chance to answer every single question on the call tonight, we will be sure to follow up via email after the webinar wraps up. And we've got a really great slate of speakers tonight. We are so excited. My colleague Ben Inskeep will sort of kick off the presentations tonight. He's going to do a really deep dive into what we're expecting to see from hyperscaler data centers in Indiana in the coming years. What we are expecting to see in terms of impacts to our utility bills, how we generate energy here in Indiana, our environment, and our tax revenue as well, just to name a few things. We're also so excited to be joined by Kasia Tarczynska of Good Jobs First. Good Jobs First is a national policy resource center that works to promote corporate and government accountability in economic development projects. They do such important work, make wonderful research available to those who need it. And tonight, Kasia will be walking us through the extensive subsidies that some of the largest and most profitable companies in the world get for developing data centers around the country. We're also really thrilled to be joined by Savannah Wilson of Clean Virginia. Savannah has been super busy with the Virginia legislative session, so we're so glad that she carved out some time for us tonight. Clean Virginia is an organization that works for both clean energy and clean government in the state by taking on monopoly utility corruption in Virginia politics. Virginia is also, I think, leading the world in terms of the data center market. So we have a lot to learn from Savannah about the energy impacts of such unchecked data center growth in Virginia. So grateful to all of you for being here tonight. And really quick before I pass it off to my colleague Ben, wanted to share a little bit about who we are here at Citizens Action Coalition so that you have some context for the information that we're about to share. But we are a consumer and environmental advocacy organization that was founded here in Indiana back in 1974. And we work on a variety of issues, affordable utility rates, a cleaner environment, a stronger democracy here in Indiana. At our core, though, we are a utility watchdog, and it's through our efforts to hold monopoly utilities accountable that we've come to be engaged in hyperscaler data center work as well. As you'll see throughout Ben's presentation, part of our work at CAC is regulatory advocacy. So when utilities want to raise electric bills or they put forth 20-year energy plans, they file a lot of dense documentation in front of our state utility regulators. We raid through what they're asking for and make that information accessible to the public. And that's really, Ben has done a phenomenal job in uncovering what we're expecting to see from data centers and their impacts on our energy in the next few years. We do also watchdog utility companies at the Indiana State House because they certainly have a presence there, as do other large companies. So we work to make sure that legislators are hearing how proposed bills will impact the people of Indiana. And last but not least, we also work towards our mission by organizing communities across the state because we're up against some really big companies and we've all got to stand together to advocate for the outcomes that we need and deserve. With that, I will pass it along to Ben.
Well, thank you so much, Kelly, and welcome everybody tonight. I'm thrilled to be here. I got a ton of material to cover, so let's dive right in. So first of all, let's start with what is a data center? Would you please advance? Thank you. All right, so what is a data center? These are the facilities or warehouses that hold the computer systems and related equipment and infrastructure that are used to process, store, and distribute data. They're kind of the foundational components to things like the internet, and our very presence right here on the live stream on Zoom tonight is facilitated by a data center. So why are we talking about data centers now? Well, we have seen this trend of very, very large data centers being proposed and being constructed, not only in the United States, but across the world. Some of these data centers are now being called hyperscaler data centers because they're so large. And not only are they supporting things like cloud computing, but increasingly they're being used for applications like artificial intelligence or AI. And often they are owned by the very big tech companies that we all are familiar with, like Microsoft and Amazon, Google, and Meta. Let's turn to see where they are located in Indiana. So these are the 6 hyperscaler data centers that have been either announced or are in very late stages of planning in Indiana. Now you might think, or you might look at this map and be aware of other data centers that are being discussed or planned in your community that aren't popping up. And we recognize that there's lots of data center activity going on across the state, and that this map doesn't fully encompass every data center being considered, and that there's other types of data centers that are still large that are being considered in places like Merrillville or Michigan City or Ellettsville and other places across the state. But these are the very big tech companies that are coming to the state of Indiana. And as you can see, there is a cluster forming in the northern part of the state, although they're not exclusively there. So let's move on to discussing why they're coming here. The most important thing for these hyperscaler data centers is the speed to market. They want to be able to quickly interconnect their data centers to the transmission system or to the grid, and then be able to get the power they need to power these facilities quickly. They can construct them in a year or even less sometimes, so they're very quick once they are planned to connect to the grid, if the grid can facilitate their connection. And Indiana happens to have available high voltage capacity to interconnect these facilities to certain parts on the grid without very large upgrades to our transmission system. We also have connections to wholesale power markets across the country, as well as existing infrastructure like fiber optic networks, highways, and railways that also facilitate the construction and operation of data centers. There's other important factors too, of course. Things like subsidies matter. So for example, the state of Indiana has passed a state sales tax exemption that we'll cover a little bit later today. The cost in general can be important. For example, we do have lower cost land and available land in Indiana, as well as our business environment might be more inducing for certain businesses to come to our state. We also have proximity to key markets. And that's important because for data centers, for many customers, or at least some customers, latency is an important issue. So they want to be close to where the data center is. And finally, the natural disaster risk is relatively small in Indiana compared to some other places. Like we don't have the wildfires or earthquakes or hurricanes that some other places in this country can get. All right, let's talk a little bit about their power usage, because this is what's really motivating a lot of conversation right now across the country. Hyperscaler power demand is, well, almost off the chart, as you can see here. In fact, they can use nearly 10 times more power than the next largest customer that a utility might have. This chart right here is comparing the Amazon data center campus that's coming to northern Indiana and their power demand to some of our other very large industrial customers that are operating in Indiana or that are planning a facility in Indiana. You can see that the Amazon data center campus is using vastly more power than all of these facilities combined. For example, you see the Cleveland Cliffs Burns Harbor Steel Mill on this list. You can see there's ethanol refinery and a semiconductor plant, and yet they barely register compared to the immense power demands of this AI, or of this hyperscaler data center. So let's move on to seeing what happens when you then aggregate not just one data center like that Amazon data center, but when we have multiple data centers coming to one part of the state. Well, each of these data centers can use as much power as a city. And that's not an exaggeration. In fact, that Amazon data center campus that we saw with that power demand of over 2,000 megawatts is roughly twice the size of our smallest investor-owned utility, CenterPoint, and their peak demand on an annual basis. So these are quite large energy consumers. In fact, just the data centers that have been announced or that are in the final stages of planning in Indiana, in northern Indiana, could use more electricity than the entire Long Island and New York City combined by the end of this decade. So this is a very significant increase in electricity consumption from a relatively small handful of facilities. Next slide, please. Of course, this is not specific to Indiana in terms of this trend. Across the country, we're seeing an explosion of data centers being planned and constructed. And this is leading to some very significant projections of rising electricity usage, unlike what we've seen in recent history. In fact, we've seen data center electricity consumption already increase pretty significantly just in the past few years, going from about 76 terawatt hours to 176 terawatt hours in the span of about 6 years. By 2028, that could easily double or triple to up to 580 terawatt hours. Now, I recognize a lot of folks don't really have a readily graspable understanding of what a terawatt hour is, and I don't either, to be quite honest with you. So at the bottom, I do have that point that 100 terawatt hours per year is about the amount of electricity the entire state of Indiana uses. So that gives you a sense of the scale here. As a percentage of the whole country, though, that really stood out to me is that our data center electricity consumption has already doubled in the past 6 years, going from less than 2% of our entire country's electricity consumption to 4.4%. And that's now projected to grow to as much as 12% by 2028. That's right, 12% of all electricity consumed in the United States could be going to these data centers, in particular these hyperscaler data centers that are driving a lot of this usage. So what's driving that usage in particular? On this slide, we can see that AI, or artificial intelligence, is one of the main contributors to the large rise in power consumption by data centers. This is showing that while definitely there's other types of data centers are seeing an increase in their power consumption across time, the main component that's driving the total server electricity usage at data centers does relate to AI applications. Let's move to talking about specific examples in Indiana. So Indiana Michigan Power, or I&M, is one of our largest utilities in the state of Indiana, and they're furthest along when it comes to hyperscaler build-out in their service territory. And in fact, they're planning the largest amount of growth in our state. In fact, it's so large, they could triple their entire electricity sales by the end of this decade. This chart here shows these new data centers and their electricity consumption projections relative to all of I&M's existing customers, broken out into the commercial and industrial folks and the residential customers. And you can see they are relatively small compared to this massive new set of customers that are coming in, these hyperscaler data centers. All right, let's look at the next slide, please. So that was I&M, and we're very curious about what is happening across the rest of the state of Indiana. Unfortunately, we don't have great transparency on what all of our utilities are planning and what the data centers themselves are planning in terms of what's a real investment that they're planning versus what is a hypothetical potential that could be coming to our state. So that's definitely challenging our ability to plan ahead and to understand the full range of the impacts. But we have developed a plausible scenario of what we think could happen based on some of the best data that we do have available to us today. That would include both I&M and NIPSCO, another Indiana utility's integrated resource planning load forecasting, which does incorporate this very large load growth they're expecting from new data center customers. So these two utilities are planning the most of our utilities, and we've also incorporated an assumption about additional data centers that could come to other portions of our state. For example, a few slides ago, we saw the different hyperscalers that are planned for Indiana. That included 2 metadata centers. Neither of those metadata centers that are planned, and one of which is under construction already, would be included in that I&M and NIPSCO load forecast. So we've included an assumption there to accommodate other data center load growth. And based on this scenario, we think it's plausible that up to 7,900 megawatts could be coming to Indiana by 2032. And it's certainly possible it could be more than that. So let's see what would the impact be on the state of Indiana if that does come to fruition. This chart is showing our retail electricity sales across the entire state of Indiana. Let's focus first on the left-hand part of this graph. This is showing that historically, over about the past 25 years or so, our electricity consumption in the state of Indiana has been relatively flat. Sure, there's some bumps, there's some ups and downs, but overall it's hovered around 100 terawatt hours per year. But as we look to the right-hand side of the graph, going out into the future, we see that once we add in this data center load forecast or scenario assumption, we see that data centers could lead to a 57% increase in our electricity consumption across the state of Indiana by 2032. That's massive and unprecedented. We obviously have not seen anything like this in recent decades, as this chart shows. Let's go to the next slide and see how it's going to impact our overall peak demand. This is the amount of power you use on the hottest day of the summer, pretty much when AC is blasting full throttle. How does that impact our peak demand? Historically, we do have a little bit more bumps, ups and downs, if you will, because the weather does vary from year to year. So you do have a little bit more variation, perhaps, in that peak. But overall, it's hovered around 20,000 megawatts. In this chart and the previous chart, both rely on some of the data provided by the State Utility Forecasting Group. And then I've layered on the CAC data center scenario on top of that. So I should clarify that. And this chart also shows that the demand is also going to rise precipitously under this scenario as well, potentially a 39% growth in our peak usage by 2032. Next slide, please. This significant growth in a very short amount of time is really concerning when it comes to the potential impacts on our utility bills. And not just the utility bills of the data centers, but I'm talking about the utility bills of all Hoosiers. Why do we think utility bills could increase? Well, first of all, there's the sudden increase occurring in a time when supply is relatively constrained. So this large growth in demand when supply is relatively constrained is going to put upward pressure on all electricity market and power market prices. There's also an issue where data centers are not paying their fair share. They're not always paying their transmission costs. For example, Duke Energy has already socialized the cost of some transmission upgrades for a Meta data center onto all of its customers, rather than making Meta pay for those costs. Utilities often will also allocate their costs using antiquated methodologies that result in residential customers being stuck with an unfair portion of the system costs, meaning data centers could be paying a too small share of the overall system costs. There's a few more things on here, but I'll just point one more out, and that is the large push we've seen in Indiana for the development of small modular nuclear reactors. We don't have any nuclear power plants in Indiana, and there's not a single small modular nuclear reactor that's been constructed in America to date. Yet we do have some companies pushing very strenuously for this technology, even though it's unproven, very expensive, and very likely to experience many delays. So I just note a word of caution about these data centers pushing for these SMRs. They are asking for other ratepayers to subsidize the costs and the risks, and that could very well lead to very significant rate increases in the future for Hoosiers. Next slide, please. We might be tempted to think that maybe the economic development benefits of data centers will make it worthwhile. But I want to address that head on in a couple ways. First, let's look at the job creation that data centers provide. Data centers typically provide very few jobs, usually in the dozens to, if it's hyperscaler, maybe a few hundred jobs if you're lucky. When you look at it on a per unit basis or per unit of energy consumption basis, I should say, data centers look even less attractive. In fact, other economic development in Indiana can generate 100 times or more jobs per unit of power than a data center does. And this is not according to my math, but rather according to Indiana Michigan Power's very own analysis of their economic development that they've seen in northern Indiana in the past few years, compared to what the data centers that are coming to northern Indiana are providing. And as we can see from this chart, data centers provide next to no jobs relative to the massive power consumption that they demand. Next slide, please. Now, I know there's a lot of words on this slide, so I just wanted to focus maybe on the top quote here. This is addressing this economic development argument. we hear a lot about how data centers result in a lot of investment. And it could be true that building a data center does require construction and investment upfront. However, as we've seen, these very, very large hyperscaler power demands are so large that when they come into a system, they can gobble up all of the remaining available transmission capacity and generation capacity, meaning there's none left over for new customers. So for example, we could be stuck with not being able to facilitate new economic development, bring in a new factory, manufacturing facility, an industrial facility, because the utility no longer has the capacity to quickly interconnect them to the grid. So this top quote here we see from the president and COO of Indiana Michigan Power, who said in sworn testimony in front of the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission that the capacity needs of the large load customers, like data centers, require significant resources, and this in turn impacts the opportunity for other new loads to be served without delay. In some cases, I&M has communicated it could be 7 to 10 years before capacity may be available. So I really want to emphasize with data centers, we could be putting all our eggs in one basket here. When we invest in data centers, it means we might be crowding out potential investment from other industries that provide maybe more benefits to our state, more jobs to our state, and that's worthy of consideration. Next slide, please. Let's talk briefly about the sales tax exemption that exists in Indiana. I'm excited to hear more from Kasia after my presentation here about the subsidies that go to data centers, but I wanted to touch on one element of the Indiana sales tax exemption briefly. So just to set the table here, this was a sales tax exemption that was passed back in 2019, before we had this explosive growth in data centers and before we even knew what a hyperscaler was. This tax exemption that's still on the books would allow any data center coming to Indiana to get up to 50 years of sales tax exemption if they meet certain investment thresholds. Importantly, this includes a sales tax exemption on the electricity usage, which is significant because in Indiana, we pay a 7% sales tax on our electricity bills. And I've highlighted here some of the Legislative Services Agency's analysis of this sales tax exemption when it passed, and they had a very low estimate, I should note, about what the impacts are going to be. Of course, this was many years before the hyperscaler data centers were coming to Indiana. So in fairness to them, it was a hard sales tax credit to understand the full impacts of. But today we're definitely seeing the shortcomings of that inability to understand what was coming ahead of us. So let's move to the next slide to see how this could be quantified. I should note, there is no federal or state government agency that is trying to tally up how much in subsidies is going to data centers. In fact, the state of Indiana is not even calculating how much the sales tax exemption is going to be worth for these data centers. And I find that potentially pretty troubling because of the large fiscal impact that the sales tax exemption could have on the state of Indiana. So, for example, Indiana Michigan Power provided us data recently that indicated that the electric bill of a 1,000 megawatt hyperscaler data center would be expected to be about $500 million on an annual basis. And so using that information, we're able to calculate what could the ballpark impact be across the state of Indiana if that same type of electric bill were applied to the other data centers coming to Indiana as well. Using that basic assumption, we can see that this sales tax exemption for a 1,000 megawatt hyperscaler data center would result in a foregone sales tax of $34.5 million per year, just on their electric utility bill. Now, when we apply that across all data centers coming to Indiana that we know about, using our scenario of 7,900 megawatts, that would be a fiscal impact of $272 million per year in Indiana, or over a 50-year period, that would be $13.6 billion. And of course, we know electricity bills don't stay the same, do they? They tend to rise over time. So if we incorporate an assumption about how electricity prices could rise over time, we see that impact could be even more significant. Just a 2% per year increase in our electric rates could result in an impact of $23 billion over 50 years. Next slide, please. So that's a humongous impact. And again, that was just on the electricity bills of these customers. That's not the full breadth of the subsidies that these facilities are getting. Let's pivot now to talk about the climate impacts because they're very important. I want to note, though, that we have had some progress in the state of Indiana when it comes to reducing our CO2 emissions. In fact, emissions from the power sector have fallen by nearly half over the past 20 years or so in the state of Indiana, thanks to things like the retirement of coal plants and the build out of renewable energy like solar and wind. So I want to acknowledge that we've made progress to date. And with that, I'm also curious then, how are these new facilities that are being built in Indiana with tremendous energy consumption, how are they going to impact this hard-fought climate progress that many advocates in Indiana have worked tirelessly for years to achieve? Let's check it out in the next slide. So data centers can threaten this climate progress, most notably by the fact that there's a huge planned expansion of natural gas power plants and facilities across America right now, including in Indiana, to serve these facilities. In fact, just two Indiana utilities you can see on the slide, NIPSCO and I&M, are planning massive expansions in the thousands of megawatts of new natural gas power plants to serve these facilities in particular. That's not all, though. We even have a coal plant in Indiana that was scheduled for retirement in 2023, but the utility company, instead of retiring it, ended up selling it to a coal company called Hallador, and Hallador is now using this data center boom to go out and try to find a long-term customer for their coal plant. And they've already indicated that they're in final stages of negotiations for a long-term contract that would keep this coal plant open indefinitely into the future. Next slide, please. So let's look at one by one here at NIPSCO, followed by I&M, to see how this data center load growth that they're projecting for their service territories in Indiana could change their trajectories when it comes to the climate pollution that they emit. So NIPSCO has had a significant reduction in their CO2 emissions in the past as they've retired coal plants. And you can see from the gray line in this chart that under the no data center scenario, that trajectory would continue. In fact, we'd see a 67% decrease under the utilities no data center scenario in their recent resource planning. However, if the 2.6 gigawatts of data centers that they're planning do come to fruition and are added to their load, that would completely reverse that trend. And in fact, we would see a 30% increase in their emissions over the next decade. Next slide, please. Similar thing with I&M. We've had tremendous success with I&M. They've, in the past, they've reduced their climate pollution by 75% between 2005 and 2024. So we've made great strides on reducing pollution. And in fact, they were scheduled and are still scheduled to phase out their Rockport coal plant by 2028. However, we saw in a previous slide that they are planning now a massive expansion of natural gas potentially. This is still a preliminary proposal by I&M. They have not finalized their resource plan yet, so they're still looking at different portfolios of resources. So this is their base case that they have preliminarily shown results for. But under this base case, it would be a very significant increase in our emissions, a more than doubling of CO2 emissions just in the next 10 years, and a tripling of CO2 emissions over the next 20 years. So we're encouraging I&M to do much more when it comes to clean energy than this base case scenario, which would result in a catastrophic increase in CO2 emissions. Next slide, please. There's a lot of other data center impacts that we just don't have the time to get into detail today, but I did want to flag water consumption is a major concern, and these data centers can be very thirsty. They can consume, or withdraw at least, millions of gallons of water per day primarily for cooling purposes. A lot of computers generate a lot of heat and need a lot of cooling, and so water is used by data centers for cooling purposes, for example. There's a lot of local impacts too that need to be considered. Everything from backup diesel generators that are located at data centers to provide backup power to noise and light pollution that can accompany them as well. And grid stability and reliability is a major concern as well. One recent analysis by Bloomberg showed that where data centers locate, it creates grid stability concerns on the grid that can create serious conditions, including the conditions that can lead to house fires. So we need to be very careful that where we build data centers, that we're making sure we're ensuring the power is reliable and stable, and that any upgrades needed to the system to ensure that are paid for by those data centers. Next slide, please. I don't have time to get into all the impacts and thoughts about when it comes to AI. I just want to flag, though, and recognize that given these data centers in large part are being driven by the growth of artificial intelligence, that there's a lot of negative impacts that artificial intelligence is having. So I did want to acknowledge that and say that I definitely think this is important to consider as a society, whether we want to continue to pursue this kind of technology, and particularly given the significant impacts that the data centers can cause. Next slide, please. I'm going to close with 2 slides here on some developments. One is CAC's landmark settlement that we're proud to have reached back in October of last year. That is currently pending, but we're hopeful the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission will approve in the coming weeks. This settlement agreement was unanimous with Indiana Michigan Power, the data centers that are coming to their service territory, and the state's consumer advocate, the Office of Utility Consumer Counselor. The settlement will help protect existing ratepayers from the risks associated with new data centers, and it does so in several ways. It's going to force these hyperscaler data centers to have long-term contract commitments, so they're not going to just shut down at the drop of a hat and leave stranded assets falling onto other customers to pay for. They're going to have to demonstrate collateral requirements to prove that they can pay those very big energy bills and that they're serious customers. They have large minimum payments that they're going to have to make each month, much larger than any type of customer, to guarantee that even if their power usage is less than they're expecting, they're still going to be paying back the utility for the major costs and upgrades that they're going to make on their behalf. If the data center tries to close early and skip town, they're going to have to pay more than a $1 billion early termination fee. That's a really hefty chunk of change that's going to be used by the utility to offset any potential stranded asset costs that otherwise would fall onto other customers. So it's a form of protecting customers from potential impacts should a worst case scenario arise. And it also gives more transparency. I&M is going to have reporting requirements on large load customers that are going to be filed with the commission, and we're going to work with them to make sure that there's public versions of those reports. I also want to note that we're proud to have secured in this settlement agreement a provision that hyperscaler data centers are going to be contributing to income qualified programs such as the weatherization programs. That's over $7 million going to that. So that's another good outcome of the settlement agreement. Last slide, please. So I did want to briefly also highlight that the Citizens Action Coalition has called for a hyperscaler data center moratorium. In other words, we think we need to press pause on adding additional hyperscalers beyond what has already been announced in the state of Indiana, given the host of concerns that we flagged here on this webinar tonight. We think the state of Indiana should study those fiscal, economic, environmental, energy, water, and utility bill impacts and risks of data centers and reevaluate whether our policy is still serving the Hoosiers well. Other states should also consider doing similar studies, and we invite other groups to echo our call for moratorium where it makes sense for them. We need protections for ratepayers, for taxpayers, and the environment, and right now we don't have those protections in place when it comes to these massive growth in hyperscaler data centers in Indiana. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. You covered a lot of ground, and there are certainly a lot of impacts that we are expecting to see in the next few years. We will turn now to Kasia with Good Jobs First to talk more about subsidies for these data center companies.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here today. So I will spend this couple of minutes to tell you about economic development subsidies data centers have been enjoying across the country and the impact of these massive tax breaks have on public budgets. So Good Jobs First, we are a research and policy organization, and we have been promoting transparency and accountability in economic development, state and local incentives for the last 25 years. We track subsidies and corporate violations in our databases. We write reports on the impact of those corporate subsidies have on the government ability to pay for public services such as schools. And we pay very close attention to highly subsidized industries such as data centers. So next slide, please. So I will start first with maybe explaining what economic development subsidies are so that we are all on the same page. So basically, subsidies are any form of public financial support provided to individual company by state and local governments in exchange for job creation or investment. Subsidies usually come in a form of some kind of tax break. So for every tax a company should be paying to state or local government, there is some kind of tax credit, exemption, reduction that basically reduces or totally eliminates that company obligation to pay tax. And these subsidies are layered on top of each other. What I mean by that is that a company can claim all of these different tax breaks for one project. Next slide, please. So there are two very profitable subsidies to data center industry. As Ben mentioned, the first one is sales and use tax exemptions on purchasing different things that are needed to build and operate a data center. So it's computers, cables, storage, shelves, electricity, as we heard. So these subsidies are specifically created for data centers. More than 30 states have those programs now. And as Ben mentioned, they can last for a very long time. In case on Indiana, if a company is approved for this program, it's approved for up to 50 years, meaning for 50 years, when a company is buying something for data centers, company doesn't pay sales tax on that. Another very large subsidy is our property tax abatement on local level. These also can last for decades, 10, 15, 30 years. And they also are very high. They can be 50 to 100% abatement. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, these subsidies are layered on top of each other. And because of that, we noticed a huge increase in the cost of the subsidy deals to individual companies. Usually those are companies that dominate this industry, so Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Meta. And I have an example here from from Indiana. So Amazon will benefit from estimated $4.3 billion in tax breaks from state and local government for its data center complex. Majority of that money, 4.2 billion, will come from local tax breaks. And this amount does not even include 50 years sales tax exemption. And this is not unusual. Amazon received $1 billion property tax break from Morrow County, Oregon in 2023, for example. So these subsidies are quite expensive. Next slide, please. So not only these individual deals for data center projects are growing, but also the cost of state sales and use tax exemptions are growing quite rapidly across the country. And we notice this trend in many states. But the biggest, almost in some way uncontrolled increase in this particular subsidy cost we noticed in Virginia, which, as we will hear in a couple of minutes, is a hub for data centers. So back in 2017, Virginia's sales and use tax exemption program cost the state about $65 million in 1 year. 6 years later, the same program cost about $750 million by one data source. So it's an increase of over 1,000% in this program. And there are real life consequences to this. So there is $750 million less in Virginia budget to pay for public services that everybody benefits from, like veteran services, for example. And again, we've seen this spike in many other states across the country. So this is a really cautionary story from Virginia about cost of this program. Next slide, please. So because property taxes are the main revenue source for school districts across this country, schools are another public service that can lose quite a lot of tax revenue because of data centers deals. So here in this example, you will see that Morrow County, Oregon, so Morrow County has been hosting Amazon data centers for a few years now. And Morrow County School District reported that in 2023, it lost $19 million to tax abatements, economic development tax abatements. $14 million out of that 19 was because of property tax abatements to Amazon data centers. So this is 200 additional teachers that could have been hired only if these companies that are getting this property tax abatement paid in fair share in taxes. Next slide, please. So we very often hear this argument that subsidies are needed to attract data center and other projects to a state or locality. But as you can see in this quote from Microsoft official, that's actually incorrect. So he says, I can think of a site selection or placement decision that was decided on a set of tax incentives. So what this means is that when businesses, companies, when they make site selection decision, they look at business reasons, as Ben mentioned before in his presentation. So data centers look for places that have access to cheap energy and water, that they're looking for places with a lot of open land and cheap land. They're looking for places with cooler climates and places that are free from natural disasters. So subsidies don't really matter in these site selection decisions. So basically what we are doing is we're providing these massive tax breaks to these profitable large corporations for something that they would do even without these subsidies. Next slide, please. So I very quickly want to touch on two very important things. One of them is lack of job creation, and Ben was talking about it as well. So that's true. Data centers create a very limited number of jobs, maybe 20, 50 jobs per data center per building. And in this example right here, Fulton County, this is where Atlanta is located. They approved $10 million for a project that had zero new jobs. So because the number of jobs is so limited, but the subsidies are so huge, we estimated in one of our studies that subsidy cost per job at a data center is about $2 million. So what that means is that at this rate, it's extremely difficult for state and local governments to recoup that lost tax revenue that is given to these big companies. Next slide, please. And the last point I want to make is that there is profound lack of transparency around these subsidy deals for data centers, and it's true across the country. Often big tech companies, when they're applying for subsidies, they're hiding behind project code names, they're hiding behind LLC subsidiaries, they're hiding behind developer names. And it was true also here in Indiana. In 2023, Fort Wayne approved a subsidy package for a data center complex, and it did under a project code name, Project Zodiac. Public didn't know who this company was. So only after a deal was done, it was revealed that it was Google data center. But the secrecy didn't stop there, because the state negotiated sales and use tax exemption with the company. But when you look at the transparency portal of Indiana Economic Development Corporation, you don't see Google. You see this strange Hatchworks LLC name, which is actually Google, but you don't see Google, you see this LLC. And because of that, it's just so hard for the public to know which companies are subsidized, how much money, public money they're getting, what are they supposed to do in exchange of that money, and if they're doing what they're supposed to do. So next slide, please. So I just want to leave you with a couple of takeaways. So first, there are a few very large, very wealthy companies that benefit from billions in tax breaks and other public support across the country. The public costs of these subsidies are growing rapidly, but these projects create very limited number of jobs. And at the end of the day, these subsidies, billions of dollars we're giving to these companies, they don't count when it comes to site selection decision. And lastly, there's just this huge secrecy and lack of transparency around the subsidy deals. So thank you so much for listening. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Kasia. That is fascinating. Big companies getting huge tax breaks with lack of transparency. Imagine that. We will shift now to Savannah Wilson with Clean Virginia to hear more about what's happening in Virginia. Savannah, the floor is yours.
Amazing. So as Kelly just said, my name is Savannah Wilson, and I'm an energy policy analyst at Clean Virginia. So we're a nonprofit organization that advocates for electric utility ratepayers and an affordable energy transition in Virginia. I have a tendency to talk quickly. I'm going to do the best I can to talk at a pace so that people can understand me. We'll see how it goes. So I'm going to be talking about the data center industry in Virginia. I'll start by giving an overview of the industry, then move to discussing the energy impacts and cost impacts the industry is having and is predicted to have. And then I'll conclude by discussing efforts in Virginia to put in place a responsible framework for data center development. Before I jump in, I just want to make one quick note. Last month, a state legislative commission called JLAR released a report on data centers after studying the topic for the past year. I'm going to reference this report a lot, so if I say JLAR report, that's what I'm referring to. In many ways, Virginia is unique, but in many other ways, the challenges and potential solutions we have here reflect the challenges and opportunities other states are and will be facing as data center demand increases throughout the country. For example, a lot of the issues I'm going to talk about are similar to the ones that Ben talked about earlier. Next slide, please. So Virginia has the largest data center market in the United States and the world by far. So if you look at the chart on this slide, this is from 2024, so very recent, and can give you some sense of this. It compares the IT electric load of Virginia's data center with those of other data center markets. So the load for Virginia is that really big blue line you can see there on the left, and it is more than 2 times the load of the next largest market in Beijing. The industry is also predicted to continue its trend of enormous growth into the future. So for example, a 2023 report found that Virginia led the US in predicted electric demand from planned data center projects and not just in demand from existing data centers. Next slide, please. So what does this actually look like practically for Virginia to be the largest data center market? According to the JLAR report that I'm going to keep coming back to, Virginia has about 340 data center buildings on 150 different sites. All these data centers take up the floor space of around 1,000 football fields. And it's important to remember that these numbers account only for existing data centers. They don't include the planned projects in the state. The map on the right, which is taken from the JLAR report, shows data centers in blue dots. As it shows, the industry is primarily concentrated in Northern Virginia, but it's been expanding throughout the state. So in Richmond, where I'm currently working during the legislative session, we have data centers in the surrounding counties, and we also have existing or planned data centers in multiple regions throughout Virginia. Next slide, please. So this slide has a lot of numbers, but bear with me. As the data center industry has expanded in Virginia, it's brought with it a number of challenges. So this includes concerns around water use, transparency, noise, land use, and pollution from diesel backup generators. I'm going to focus on just the 2 issues that Clean Virginia has been most focused on. So those are energy use and ratepayer cost impact. But the other challenges associated with the industry are also significant, and they're being worked on by a lot of talented and really committed people and groups across Virginia who know way more about them than I do. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into data center energy use. So as Ben laid out in his presentation, data centers use an enormous amount of electricity to operate. The 340 data centers currently in Virginia use around 5 gigawatts of electricity, which is the same as the amount of energy used by 60% of Virginia households. That's a staggering number, but what's even more staggering are the predictions for data centers' future energy use. So if you look down to this second bullet point, that's going to show you those. The Dominion Energy Zone encompasses most of Virginia's electric utility customers, including Virginia's current data center market. Data centers are currently using 5 gigawatts of the zone's total 25 gigawatts. But by 2030, which somehow is only 5 years from now, this data center demand is predicted to triple to 15 gigawatts. By 2039, 14 years from now, it's predicted to grow to 25 gigawatts, which is 5 times its current amount. Dominion Energy has also received 50 gigawatts, so double the entire electricity demand of the Dominion Energy Zone of capacity requests from potential data center customers. Obviously, not all of these capacity requests are going to result in real data center projects, but the Dominion Energy official who shared this number said the utility would plan as if they would. Finally, data center growth is also predicted outside of the Dominion Zone. So this includes multiple gigawatts of potential projects in the territory of Virginia's second largest electric utility, which aren't included in these numbers I have on this slide. Next slide, please. The JLERC report also discusses rising data center demand. So it says that data centers are predicted to drive a near tripling of total electric demand in Virginia in the next 15 years if nothing is done to constrain their power demand. So if you look at the chart on the right, there's that really light line down at the bottom. That is what our demand growth would look like without any new data center growth. So as you can see from that, there would be only a minuscule increase in Virginia's electric demand in the next 15 years if it weren't for data center demand. Next slide, please. So what does a tripling of electric demand in the next 15 years mean? It means enormous amounts of new infrastructure that would need to be built to meet. So the JLERC report found that meeting this demand increase would be extremely difficult, regardless of whether Virginia's clean energy policies are followed, and even if large amounts of new wind, solar, and gas generation are added to the system. Meeting the demands of unconstrained data center growth, so data center growth if nothing happens to slow it down or stop, would require devoting huge amounts of land to solar development, finding and developing new offshore wind sites, and the construction of new gas-fired generation at breakneck speed. And with all that, it would still be a challenge to actually meet the demand. Dominion Energy, which is Virginia's largest electric utility, recently released its resource planning document that it releases every 2 years. In this document, they expressed a plan to build several gigawatts of new gas generation, and they said multiple gigawatts of that generation would not be needed if it weren't for data center demand. So that's just one example of the practical impact of this data center demand driving need for new generation. Next slide, please. So all this new generation that is liable to be built to meet data center demand can have a wide range of harmful impacts. So this includes environmental impacts, emission impacts, and public health consequences. Additionally, if we can't get enough energy to meet this demand, then we risk not having enough electricity to serve everyone who needs it. Further, and what I'm going to discuss here, data center demand growth is presenting serious cost impacts for public electric utility ratepayers. Increased data center demand threatens to produce added costs in a variety of ways. So first, we have the construction of new energy infrastructure. So in addition to the generation infrastructure like gas, solar, wind, and nuclear that I discussed a few minutes ago, this also includes the construction of new transmission lines needed to connect new data centers to electric generation. These projects are really expensive and so would drive high increased costs. Second, as data center demand rises, Virginia utilities are likely to become increasingly reliant on purchasing energy from out of state through a regional electricity market where prices are volatile and unpredictable. As other states in our region are also suffering constraints from their own rising data center demand, prices on the market are likely to increase, which means that if we go buy energy on that market, those costs are likely to be higher. Third, the limited supply of energy in Virginia and elsewhere is likely to drive overall higher prices for energy. Because data center demand is increasing throughout our region and throughout the country, that means that states and utilities everywhere are now going to be fighting for a limited supply of the resources needed to build new electric infrastructure. As the supply of those resources might go down, the prices for them will probably go up. This means that the cost of getting energy is likely to rise regardless of whether utilities obtain energy out of state or build their own. I also want to briefly note that there's a chance, given all the unknowns around future data center demand, that demand will not materialize as predicted, and that's a very real possibility. In that case, utilities might end up building large amounts of new generation and transmission infrastructure that isn't actually needed, potentially to serve prospective data center customers that never even show up to pay utility rates. But those costs are still going to have to be paid for somehow and are likely to be recovered from other ratepayers. Next slide, please. So the JLERC report very kindly gave us some concrete numbers to look at in terms of what the impact to ratepayers might look like. So as shown in the highlighted text in the table on the right, the JLERC report predicts that data centers will increase the bill of Dominion Energy's average residential customer by $23 a month or $276 a year by 2030. This means that just 5 years from now, each residential customer is predicted to be paying hundreds of extra dollars a year solely because of data center demand. And by 2040, the JLERC report predicts this number rising to $37 a month or $444 a year. Next slide, please. So all this is very stressful and concerning, and we are all very stressed out and concerned by it. But I'm going to close by turning to the constructive side of this equation, so what people are doing about all these problems. This year, a bipartisan group of Virginia legislators, supported by a range of organizations throughout the state, unveiled a framework for responsible data center. The goal of this framework is not to put a stop to data center development in Virginia, but instead to ensure that future data center growth is done responsibly. So we have 4 different pillars in this framework. The first pillar addresses the costs that data centers impose on ratepayers, so what I just talked about in the previous slide. Through this pillar, we're aiming to find legislation that protects Virginia families and businesses from bearing increased costs because of the data center industry's growth. The second pillar focuses on increasing transparency, establishing reporting standards for things such as data centers' energy and water use, to make it easier to make better decisions and to see what's actually going on. The third pillar would help ensure that data center development remains aligned with what Virginia has the ability to manage. Currently, data center projects are approved entirely at the local level. But this legislation would establish a statewide review process for proposed data center projects to ensure that there's a place where regional and statewide impacts can be considered in the approval process for data centers. Finally, our fourth pillar would modify Virginia's current sales and use tax exemption for data centers to ensure that data centers receive that exemption only if they abide by responsible efficiency and energy standards. Virginia's legislative session started a few weeks ago, so the fate of some of these pillars for this year are sealed while others are still unknown. It's really challenging to pass legislation, especially when data center companies have a heavy lobbying presence. Nevertheless, this framework has the ability to guide the essential elements of responsible data center development beyond a single bill or a single legislative session. Our state utility regulator also may be taking steps to continue addressing cost issues, and we are looking forward to engaging in that process. And then finally, before I close, our organization is also looking into solutions to some of the larger systemic problems that help drive some of these issues. In our current regulatory structure for utilities, there are a range of incentives for electric utilities that result in them exacerbating rather than helping alleviate these problems. For example, electric utilities get to earn more profit when they build more expensive infrastructure projects. This means that our biggest electric utility, Dominion Energy, has been incentivized to try to encourage huge data center growth in Virginia, because the more energy demand there is, the more expensive projects it gets to build, the more profit it gets to earn. Our state's Department of Energy, along with the State Corporation Commission, which regulates utilities, is currently working on a study of performance-based regulation, which might offer a different set of incentives to our electric utilities. And we've been grateful to take part in that and are looking forward to continuing to do that. A better regulatory framework for utilities, combined with these 4 pillars of responsible data center growth, could help limit the risks associated with data centers in Virginia. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Savannah. What an exciting framework to see, and I'd love to see that expanded all around the country, and of course in Virginia as well. Folks, we will wrap up and get to questions in just a minute, so if you've been holding back, please ask those questions. We've got just a couple more slides, and this is really channeled towards our Hoosiers on the call this evening, folks in Indiana. There are obviously a lot of places that we can plug in and pull together to advocate to protect our communities from some of these negative impacts of data centers. Right now, though, the Indiana General Assembly is in session, so it is essential that we focus our energy where it matters the most, and that is on contacting our state policymakers. Of course, there are other ways that, and it's very important to stay informed because these issues aren't going to go away anytime soon. There are a lot of great groups, including CAC and others across Indiana and around the country, that are going to continue to keep an eye on these developments and advocate for people and our environment as well. But to focus in really quickly for folks on the call tonight, we make it very easy for you to get a hold of your state lawmakers, and you can do that on our website at sidac.org/data centers. on the right side of the page, if you're logging in on your computer, you can plug in your contact information to send an email to your state legislators, urging them to press pause on any more of these new hyperscaler facilities, and also work to protect Hoosier utility customers from even more increases than we're already seeing across the state. I think it's, you know, really puts things into perspective when Savannah mentions that they know that bills will be increasing by hundreds of dollars a year to serve these data centers, and folks just can't afford to do that. While you're on our website making your voice heard by contacting legislators, please know that there are other ways to get engaged with us. We're a nonprofit fighting big companies, so chipping in helps us to keep up the fight, absolutely. We'd also love to keep you up to date via email and text, so you can do that on our website as well. And last but certainly not least, of course, you will find access to these slides and a recording of the webinar on our website as well. Okay, so I am going to adjust a couple things. And there we go. We will dive in with our questions now. Okay, so thank you so much to everyone for asking these questions. Ben, I'm gonna start with you because you were chatting about this already, but how does the new DeepSeek OpenAI model just announced change the need or some of the buzz about changes with the new AI models that have come out recently?
Yeah, that's right. This past week, we've seen a couple different models released by different companies in China that have purported to train and create AI models that are much less energy intensive and less costly than some of these AI models being developed by some of the big tech companies in America. I think it's still very much early days, but we did see today the market react to some of these models. We saw NVIDIA lose $589 billion in their market cap, the single largest stock market loss in stock market history as a result of this. And NVIDIA is the company that makes the computer chips that are used in AI data centers specifically. So we are seeing, some very interesting developments the past week. It's kind of probably too early to tell what all the ripple effects of this could be, whether or not the market is overreacting or not. But certainly it's interesting to see that the way that these chips are used, there's potentially very large efficiencies that could be gained relative to what the big tech companies are planning on today. So it's very possible we could see a future where maybe some of these large energy growth scenarios are mitigated somewhat. So I think it's a little bit hard to speculate at the moment, other than to note that this is rapidly changing and that we're seeing that potentially there's some very large efficiencies to be gained. And definitely something we're going to all be watching closely.
Thank you so much, Ben. Kasia or Savannah, anybody want to jump in, or shall we move on to the next question?
I would just add that I feel like that particularly underscores how uncertain data center load forecasts are. So we have all these forecasts for significant growth. And obviously, we're going to start building as if those forecasts are certain. But with a new advance like this, it's very easy for that to suddenly change, and then to have all these pieces of infrastructure that have been built that you may no longer need because all of a sudden your systems are more efficient. So I think that development just really emphasizes the fact that we have forecasts, but we really don't know for certain whether they're actually going to hold true.
And to quickly chime in with one point, Savannah, you raised a great point, and I think that's exactly why we need these consumer protections in place, such as the consumer protections that were part of that settlement agreement I mentioned. If there is this kind of scenario that happens where that technology changes very rapidly and suddenly, and we all of a sudden don't need this tremendous energy usage and the energy demand shrinks or goes away, we need to make sure existing customers are protected and that they're not going to be bearing the cost of these very large resources that are going to be built on behalf of these data center companies.
Thank you. Thank you both. Kasia, I'm going to turn to you. We've got a couple questions here that I think I'm going to merge into one, but someone has responded to the fact that you mentioned that tax subsidies don't necessarily play a role in choosing a site for a data center. There's a lot of other factors that folks consider. But where is the push for subsidies coming from then? You know, who benefits than these big corporations? With a follow-up, because I'm throwing a lot out at you all at once, have we ever seen tax abatements reversed?
Yes, unfortunately, this is the way how economic development has been done in this country for many, many years, if not well, for decades. It's with economic development subsidies by providing these tax breaks to companies. And, very often public officials believe that they are doing a good thing, providing tax breaks, because they think that they can bring jobs to their localities. So, in a way, it's there is this huge also push from companies that do expect those tax breaks because that's the way they've always operated. So there needs to be a huge reform, on state and local level when it comes to subsidies, and kind of we all need to come to realizations that we can do economic development in a very different way. So it's quite complicated story actually. And can subsidies be reversed? Yes. So what we advocate for at our organization is that every subsidy program, every incentive program should have a sunset date, meaning a program needs to be evaluated every 3 to 5 years, and there needs to be a sunset date when the program is supposed to expire. That gives an opportunity to state officials to look at the program to see if it works, if it doesn't, if it returns positive or negative investment, if it's a positive or negative investment for the state. But once a contract is signed with companies, it's a little bit tricky because it's a contract.
Thank you so much, Kasia. Thank you very much. And I think it just shows, with emerging issues like this, there's a lot that we're going to figure out as we go, especially when we're jumping in 2 feet first with these large energy guzzling facilities and, again, lots of subsidies. Ben, I'm going to kick it back to you. And we're going to talk a little bit about water use because I'm seeing several different questions here as I scroll through. So I guess where is the primary water use for these data centers? And do we have any information about how that could impact other economic development projects in the state?
Yeah, good questions. And I'm seeing a lot of great questions about water usage in the chat and the Q&A, I should say. So appreciate that a lot of folks have a lot of concerns about water consumption, about water quality, about the impacts to their communities and other economic development. Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of information about the water impacts in the state of Indiana. A lot of this information has been kept secret, has been kept out of the public's eye. We do have a few data points that I can note. So on the terms of how much water do they use, I can say that the Amazon data center campus we discussed earlier, we don't know the exact amount of water it will use, but we do know that the water consumption at that facility, as well as the GM plant that's coming in next door to that facility combined, are going to use up to 21 million gallons of water. So very large consumption of water potential there. This is going to be an area that we're going to be definitely looking into more. I don't have a ton of research to provide lots of details with you tonight, but it's definitely something that we're watching because water is definitely a critical issue for Hoosiers and in a lot of places across the country. They're having water shortage issues. So certainly data centers withdrawing water from a specific basin could mean that another economic development project doesn't have access to that water supply, or could mean that there's additional water stress during times of drought. So there's definitely some real implications that need to be carefully considered. And it definitely goes to the concerns we have generally in the state of Indiana about our water policy and making sure that it's done in a thoughtful way where things are planned well, and that we're not just using up all of our water for every and any economic development project at the cost of potentially the environment, our communities, and other potential needs that we might have coming down the line for that water.
Thank you, Ben. Savannah, do you have any comments on water use from your experience in Virginia that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so our organization is not super involved in the water use issue, but we hear things peripherally from other organizations. So I would just say that it's definitely a concern. We have the same sorts of issues with single projects wanting to build large or wanting to build and then use large amounts of water, and then also issues projects wanting to transfer water from one water basin to another. The JLERC report said that water wasn't currently a huge concern, but a lot of groups who are really involved with water took issue with that, and they didn't really reflect on what sort of water issues might evolve in the future as more data centers develop. I will say one thing you hear a lot from data center developers is data centers don't use water anymore, but we haven't really seen that on the ground in terms of new data center developments are still using water. Hopefully, at some point, we will move to a system where they will be less water intensive, but at the moment, there are plenty of new data center developments that continue to be really water intensive. We continue to have a lot of potential concerns about water being moved from one place to another, or a lot of water being taken out. There's one county in Virginia that has recently been in a really protracted fight with Amazon over a data center and its water withdrawal. So I don't have a lot of concrete analysis except to say it's definitely an issue, definitely a concern. The JLERC report said it's not currently a problem, but that doesn't mean it won't have serious water repercussions in the future.
Thank you. Kasia, I will hop back to you. And we've got a question about, do you have access to any resources of how we can address the transparency of groups like the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, or IEDC, with the code names for the data centers and the NDAs?
Right, that's a wonderful question. I would say contact your state and local elected officials and tell them you care about this issue. So on city level, county level, there could be rule put in place that prohibit non-disclosure agreement. The same is on the state level, that can be laws passed that prohibit non-disclosure agreements. So NDAs are binding contracts between public officials and companies, and under these contracts, public officials cannot disclose anything about a project. So what I've seen in my work is that public officials will not disclose company names, how much money they're approved for, how many jobs will they create. Nothing can be disclosed because that's it's a demand from a company for the secrecy. So state laws can prohibit this type of agreements, and incentive subsidy programs can have rules that say, in order to receive any incentives, the state and local agency that administers these subsidies needs to disclose corporate parent of an entity that is receiving subsidies. So in the example of Google I gave you, there could be rule put in place that says the state agency has to disclose not only the LLC name, but that it is owned by Google.
Thank you so much, Kasia. Whew. Wow. I believe that this will be directed towards Ben, but I think we'd like to hear from Savannah as well, because you two have playing off well off each other with the different contexts from different states. But we've got a question stating that, Amazon claims it uses 100% renewable energy to power its operations. We know that that's achieved through a very liberal use of renewable energy credits. But how does it sell these projects to Hoosiers or Virginians in terms of clean energy usage, or does that even come up in marketing and negotiations?
Yes, that's a great question, because a lot of these big tech companies purport to have very ambitious climate or sustainability goals. But when we look at the details of how they're achieving those goals, oftentimes it is through accounting tricks. It's not through actually powering their data centers with 24/7 clean renewable energy, but rather using renewable energy or using clean energy from different parts of the grid, from different times from when they're actually using it. And what we're seeing actually being considered for the data centers in Indiana is a very large expansion of natural gas power plants. that are going to be built specifically in order to provide these facilities with power. So they could, at the end of the day, use these accounting tricks to claim that their data centers are 100% emissions free, even though the utility is building billions of dollars in new fossil fuel infrastructure to serve those facilities. So I would urge caution with some of those PR and marketing schemes from these big tech companies. We've seen that when you really dive into the details of that, a lot of times their impacts are a lot bigger than they claim to be.
I'll just build off of that and say that when you're looking at how data center companies are marketing themselves to localities, they also often don't have to rely on those claims as much, because that's not necessarily what localities are interested in. So we always phrase it as the classic tragedy of the commons, where data centers often have localized benefits for a locality, but the localities aren't suffering individually the consequences that data centers are having on the larger scale. So for example, when they're requiring the building of all these new fossil fuel facilities, that will impact all of Virginia, but this one locality will get the benefits of having the data center sited there. So it just becomes a totally different calculus when decisions about data centers are made only at the local level, and there's no sort of regional or statewide oversight for those decisions. So for a concrete example of that, last year, a county in Virginia approved a data center project, and they actually had a debate around the emissions this might cause. And the county commissioners were like, well, even if we get all these new emissions from this data center, it doesn't really matter, because I'm sure there'll be new emissions somewhere and there'll be new emissions anyway. But this data center has offered to build all this new affordable housing for us. So we really want that affordable housing project the data center is offering. So therefore, we're going to approve the data center because it's giving us all these local benefits. And all the larger scale problems aren't going to affect us that much, and they don't feel as important. So that, I think, emphasizes why one of the pillars we've established for responsible data center development has to be regional and statewide oversight, because you need some sort of group that is able to look at those larger impacts. And if the locality is trying to make a decision about what is best for the locality, those impacts aren't usually going to come and be taken into account as much.
Thank you so much. And another question that's jumping out to me is about whether large industrial customers are raising concerns about this data center growth. And, that slide from Ben was really striking to me, because Indiana, we have tons of large energy users. We're used to big steel mills and other manufacturers, and data center hyperscalers are much larger than that. So Ben, Savannah, any thoughts on industrial customers' concerns with this as well?
Yeah, I think there certainly is some concern, because the data centers and their potential to drive utility bills higher could impact those very industrial customers as well, not just residential customers. So for example, in a recent the NIPSCO rate case that's currently pending before the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission, US Steel raised concerns about the data centers coming to NIPSCO's territory, and raised concerns about how those data centers could potentially lead to rate increases, or at least expressing the desire to make sure those data centers are paying their fair share of costs. So in a surprising way, they actually had very similar testimony to a certain extent as the same issues I raised on behalf of CAC in my testimony, talking about the concerns of the data centers. And we both recommended that the commission set up a process that would allow these issues to be aired in front of the commission more holistically. So yeah, I think they're very watching this very closely. They're looking at how this could impact power markets. They're looking at how this could impact their bottom line. And some of them do have concerns.
In Virginia, just speaking from my own personal perspective, and I think people who are more involved in looking at this will probably have different perspective, I haven't seen industrial customers outwardly expressing concern as much, but definitely whenever we are talking about legislation that specifically addresses data centers, they've been very open to it. Whenever the legislation uses wording such as a high energy use customer, they are obviously far less open to that. So that's a challenge, but definitely they've been really open to any sort of legislation addressing data centers, which I think probably speaks to what Ben said, even if they're not necessarily being as explicit about concerns.
Thank you so much. And Kasia, hopping back to you, with the jump from sort of traditional data centers to hyperscaler data centers, do you sense that that will change some of the generous subsidies that are available, or any thoughts on that?
Right. That's another great question. So I think what's going to happen is this really huge increase in cost of sales and use tax exemptions and property tax abatement. And it's because once a company is approved for these subsidies, there's no limit to how much this company can receive. There's no caps on anything. So more company spends, the larger subsidy. And that's what we've seen in Virginia. That's what we've seen in Illinois or Texas, Georgia. And that's what we are going to see in Indiana, because with this hyper scale data centers, more is going to be bought and larger subsidy is going to be. So, you know what? So in 2 states, the legislators did pause for at least for well, they evaluated the subsidy program just to see if financially they make sense. So it was in Georgia, for example, the state auditor looked at their subsidy program and said that the amount of abated taxes is way higher than the taxes that data center industry is bringing to the state. So, so the tax that were brought were 1/3 of the cost of subsidy. So the incentive program has negative return on investment. Similar stories in Virginia, where for every dollar invested in sales and use tax exemption, the state is only recouping 48 cents on a dollar. So you see this negative return on investment. So what I hope is going to happen is that legislators in Indiana and other states are going to pause these programs, are going to evaluate them if they financially make sense, because in other states they do not. Yep, hope that answered the question.
Wonderful, thank you. And then Ben, we do have a couple of questions about our call for a moratorium. I'm going to kind of merge a couple things here, but how does our call for the moratorium affect the proposed settlement that we reached with the data centers? And then someone is asking in that same vein, like what's the difference between us negotiating that settlement with Indiana Michigan Power and sort of the information available from NIPSCO?
Great questions. So I think let me start with the fact that the settlement agreement came from a case before the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission, and it only impacts Indiana Michigan Power and Indiana Michigan Power customers. So it doesn't impact any other utility in the state or data centers going to other service territories. So it's really confined to just one part of our state, and that's if the commission approves it. So we think that's a very important step and a great template for other parts of the state to emulate. And we'd love to see these same consumer protections extended to other customers in other parts of the state. At the legislature, though, there is a lot of legislation being considered, and that is where they passed the sales tax exemption. So there's still important work to be done before the legislature. And that's where our call for moratorium comes into play. We think the legislature needs to take action to consider things like pausing the sales tax exemption. That's something only the legislature can do. It's not something the Utility Commission can do. So there's issues like that really we need when you want a statewide impact, when it comes to changing the law, that has to be done in the legislature. And so we really think this is something where it makes sense to have a statewide policy and the legislature to uniformly consider all the impacts of these data centers and to consider whether changes need to be made to that law. So that's kind of how those two pieces fit together. To tie in NIPSCO, NIPSCO has filed a case before the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission very recently that we are involved in as well. So we are going to be considering similar types of concerns when it comes to potential risks to customers and potential impacts to customers. But that case is earlier on in its process. So we're going to be putting forth our case in the coming months and considering actions there to make sure that NIPSCO customers are also protected from any potential negative impacts from the data centers, and we make sure we have the best possible outcomes for folks up in Northwest Indiana as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ben. I'm just going to throw this out to everyone. So data centers, and I think this might be one of our last questions, if not the last one, because we're getting quite close to 8:30, and we appreciate all of you for being with us on this journey tonight. But these data centers, or the companies behind them, they don't pay taxes. They don't provide very many jobs. What's the bonus? Why would any politician want them in their town if all they do is take our resources? What's their angle?
I can start. So a lot of times, it's PR when it comes to subsidies for elected politicians. They can say, hey, we brought Amazon, we brought Google, we brought Microsoft to the state. We are active on job creation. We generate this economic development. But we do need to remember that, it's economic development is more than just one project. One project cannot move the whole state, cannot improve economy, the whole state. It's just so unfortunately, it's very often just PR when it comes to subsidies and improving the subsidies. That they're huge job creation projects.
I think it goes back to the local level approval in a lot of cases. So it's not that data centers, for the most part, it's not that data centers don't pay any taxes. It's that they usually pay lower taxes. That means that an individual locality still is getting tax revenue from data centers that come to them. And because data centers are so big and have so much equipment, that means that having a data center in your locality can give you a lot of tax revenue. So, for example, in Loudoun County, which is the data center capital of Virginia, so the data center capital of the data center capital, they have a lot of data centers and have been able to fund a lot of public education through the tax revenue from data centers, even though data centers are still getting a tax break. So because data centers still come with tax revenue, even though there's a tax break, there's a big incentive for localities to attract data centers because it comes with this promise of tax revenue.
Yeah, and I think to Kasia's earlier point, I think these localities are often leaving a lot of money on the table. They are over subsidizing these data centers that really don't need that tax break or that tax incentive to actually locate. And as I mentioned in my presentation, there's other bigger factors like the speed to being able to locate somewhere that matter much more to these data centers. So I think it boils down to, are we making sure that the subsidies we're giving them are actually commensurate with the benefits they're providing and are actually additive and creating that opportunity in the first place, not just the data center getting subsidies it doesn't need.
If I may, just very quickly, a little caution, because in my understanding that in Virginia localities do subsidies in a very different way than a lot of other localities across the country. Virginia localities don't do these 100% property tax abatements. They create tax system where you can tax higher or lower equipment in a data center within a particular locality. So it's not individual company tax breaks, kind of like a little tax code for the whole county or city. That's my understanding. So it's a little bit different story there.
The devil is in the details. I really cannot express enough thanks to our speakers tonight. Kasia, Ben, and Savannah, you all have shared such important information with us, and I feel like connected dots, in your different aspects of advocating for data centers. So a big thank you to our panelists, a big thank you to everyone who joined us this evening and asked wonderful questions. I know we did not get to all the questions tonight. We will be following up via email over the course of this week as we're able to respond to those questions. So much gratitude to you all. Again, check out the data center webpage on Citizens Action Coalition's website. We'll be making a lot of resources available there. But we appreciate you all and have a wonderful rest of your evening.